All right. Well, hey everybody, welcome to my little hut I built in our backyard here in our little slice of paradise that we call Jack's Beach. In a turn of events that is, in my opinion, nothing short of miraculous, sheer grace. I opened the door to the sound of meowing about 10 minutes ago, and in came our cat Milky, who has opted to offer his services in today's teaching. So, with no further ado, let's just get started. This is Exodus part 12. It's called The Inner Mountain. And here is a little bit of Exodus chapter 24 and 34. We read, Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered it. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. For 6 days the cloud covered the mountain, and on the seventh day the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. To the Israelites the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on top of the mountain. And Moses entered the fire. He walked into the cloud as he went up on the mountain, and he stayed on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. When he finally came down from Mount Sinai, he wasn't aware that his face was radiant, because he had been face to face speaking with God. The Israelites were frightened by the radiance, and so whenever Moses spoke to them, he wore a veil. He veiled his face in their presence, but he removed the veil when he spoke to the Lord. This is like, I'm pretty sure, where we get the phrase mountaintop experience. This is like the original mountaintop experience. It occurred to me that we have a pretty clear roadmap in the life of Moses leading up to this mountaintop experience that I'm calling the inner mountain. And so this teaching, it's going to be concerned with the stages of healthy ego development as seen in the story of Moses. About 5 or 6 years ago, I remember seeing a t-shirt and it said, "The ego is not your amigo." And I thought, I gotta get me that shirt. I gotta stick it to my ego. Make sure that everybody knows that I'm onto my own tricks. One of my favorite songwriters, a guy called Sturgill Simpson, has a tune that opens with the line, "I woke up this morning and decided to kill my ego." And this is a pretty popular cultural idiom at the moment. But, at least in my direct experience, I've found that any attempt to kill my own ego works as an anathema to the supposed goal of union with God. I've got to admit that I spent a fair amount of the last decade attempting to murder my own ego, hoping that once it was finally out of the way, my true self would emerge. But the irony of it is that the ego is honestly quite satisfied with this new task of attempting to eliminate itself, because the ego can only direct the course of our life as long as we keep giving it something to do, some project to work on, some character flaw to be ironed out, some obstacle to overcome. As long as salvation remains close but just out of reach, then we remain on the hamster wheel of trying to prove to ourselves or to God, to anybody else, that we're worthy of salvation, even if we're not consciously thinking of it in those terms. We talked last week about this, but the Hebrew concept of salvation has much more to do with spaciousness. That's what the word can actually translate directly to. It has much more to do with spaciousness and rest than it does effort or, self-flagellation. The human ego isn't the enemy. It doesn't need to be shamed or scorned or beaten or killed off. It's, like everything else, transcended through inclusion, not exclusion. Richard Rohr has that great line, transcend and include. What the ego needs is space and time to heal, to undergo a process that leads ultimately and paradoxically to chosen surrender and conscious participation. The scriptures, as I read them, are like sacred pattern recognition software. And in the story of Moses, we see a path, or a familiar set of patterns of ego development that stretched out over multiple decades and led him, finally, to this mountaintop experience detailed in today's text. And so I want to talk about these stages of healthy ego development leading to surrender. This is by no way comprehensive. These are just things that I noticed in the story of Moses. So stage one, calling the archetype of the innocent. Look, this guy. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Moses' life begins rather dramatically, the way that everybody's does, in total vulnerability and with the shock of separation. Moses' story has some particularly extenuating circumstances to emphasize the point, which you can read about if you'd like to at the beginning of the book of Exodus. But the truth is the same for all of us. It's like life in the body always begins with crying, doesn't it? Childbirth is painful for mother and child, but for different reasons. What was once one in the process of childbirth becomes two. And all of us, right from the jump, are imprinted with the everlasting ache of being human or feline. And survival for many, many years is dependent on outside forces and grace, which is beautiful, but if we aren't careful, our innate vulnerability can calcify into feeling perpetually victimized or else completely reliant on outside forces to care for us, to protect us, to save us. Stage two, we see in Moses the development of the persona. As we grow, we develop survival strategies to cope with the feeling of separateness, and Thomas Keating laid out some of the main survival strategies that he's noticed from his work. But we develop strategies to cope with the feeling of separateness, to help us feel safe or comfortable or accepted, like we belong. And these survival strategies constellate differently in each of us, and the result is our individual personalities. Carl Jung and others point to a deepening split within. We develop a persona, which we could say is who it is I hope that you think that I am, and an ego, which is kind of who it is that I believe that I am. But both of these obfuscate the truth of who we are, our true self, which, like St. Paul said, is hidden with Christ in God. It's mystery. It's infinite mystery. I think Moses' adolescence dramatizes this split self through his dual identity. He's raised in opulence in Pharaoh's house, like Egyptian royalty, all while knowing deep down that he's a Hebrew. And the thing about the persona is it's fragile, but it's also necessary. It's how we navigate this world. It's how we choose to present ourselves. It's how we interact with others. It's how we move through this life. But it is perhaps the most fragile aspect of the psyche. And until it's noticed and integrated, the soul remains split and divided. Stage three is the emergence of shadow through the archetype of the warrior. And in Moses' case, one day he sees this Egyptian, he's beating a Hebrew slave, and he instinctively acts out what's true to his essence, which is to be the emancipator. But something's off. It doesn't quite land. The text tells us that he looked this way and that, making sure that nobody would see what he was doing. And then he strikes and he kills this Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave. And, you know, there are a few things more dangerous in this world than a wounded ego that has found its calling. It really doesn't matter how righteous our cause happens to be. When we attempt to bring it to fruition through our own effort, when we decide when it's time, from the prism of our wound, that we're in shadow. We're operating out of shadow. And in Moses' case, nobody is emancipated that day. And in fact, the next day, Moses runs into some of his fellow Hebrews, and they're in a little fight, and he tries to settle the dispute, and they say, "Are you going to kill us like you did that Egyptian yesterday?" and he thinks, oh gosh, they're on to me. And he has to move to a place called Midian and go into hiding, which is the next stage, stage 4, the hermit. In Midian, Moses spends 40 years in obscurity, in this season of hiddenness. He's working quietly, feeling unnoticed, wondering if life is passing him by. Probably beginning to learn to laugh at his own self-seriousness. Learning to finally let go of the missions and the relationships and the sense of purpose that once felt existentially necessary. The archetype of the hermit, often driven out into the wilderness because of some perceived failure, is where we learn that failure is just a label and a concept. It's arbitrary and subjective, but more importantly, can be a great teacher. Silence and solitude softens us. Long, slow years begin to refine our ideas of success. One of my favorite poems has this line in it. It's Rainer Maria Rilke. He said, "Winning doesn't tempt that man. This is how he grows. By being defeated decisively by constantly greater things." Stage 5 is divine encounter. Moses sees a bush and it's burning, but it's not consumed. And the text really emphasizes the fact that Moses has learned to see. He sees. In fact, it says, when God saw Moses see, he spoke to him from the bush. This time in hiddenness, this time in solitude, this time that certainly, I would imagine, felt purposeless for vast swaths of it, taught Moses to see. And when he looked at this bush, what he sees is a mirror. He sees himself. Because his old life had been completely burned away. But the burning revealed something indestructible at his core. Just like the bush, he was burned but not consumed. Camus wrote, "In the depths of winter I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer." Here the ego catches a glimpse of something larger than itself, something beyond itself and yet situated directly at the center of itself. Moses is 80 years old at this point, and he's finally ready to begin. This is kind of encouraging. Stage 6, the magician. He returns to Egypt. He's afraid, but he's willing to act from his center, not from the reactive edge of himself, but from the truth of who he's coming to know himself to be. T.S. Eliot has a great line in a poem called Little Gidding that goes, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time." Moses is right back where he started, but he's not the same. He carries the authority of a free person. And the thing is that free people. Pharaoh's orders upended, the Israelites walk out of Egypt free. Moses steps into his calling, but only after he begins to settle into the truth of who he is. Which takes us to the final stage for today, stage 7, the seer. Moses enters the cloud of unknowing and beholds the veiled face of God. And he looks long enough that his own countenance is radiant with reflected light. Moses embodies the archetype of the seer, one who beholds, one who is held, one who has softened and surrendered. One who's learned that we're grasped by what we cannot grasp. One who's come to understand that the tighter we hang on to anything, the less opportunity we have to experience what it is to be held. We have to let go in order to realize that we're held and that we're carried. And by finally allowing ourselves to be carried, we actually begin to participate fully in the divine presence. There's this ancient text called the Cloud of Unknowing, which beautifully is written anonymously. We don't even know the author of it. It's been passed down through the centuries. It's got a line in it that goes like this: in the quiet of not knowing, let go of your ideas, your striving, your sense of self. There in that abyss, God meets you, not as object, but as presence, as a love beyond knowing. So as much as I, dug that ego is not your amigo shirt, I've reconsidered in recent years. And I've come to realize that I've come to realize that the ego is in need of an amigo. And we can be that amigo to our own self when we stop trying to change and analyze and punish and correct and distract and maneuver and virtue signal, get the band back together, and finally write a hit song. I don't know. When the ego has been softened through testing and has learned to embrace humility, the healing begins. And it's only the healed and whole ego that's willing to finally offer itself to be consumed by union, not annihilated, but transcended and ultimately transfigured by love into the likeness of the beloved. St. Paul wrote this many centuries later. He said, "For a time, we knew in part, but as wholeness is experienced, everything that once divided simply falls away. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. But there comes a time when we'll see face to face. Today, right now, we might know in part, but there comes a time when we'll know fully, even as we ourselves are fully known. Simply turn to the Lord and the veil's lifted. The Lord is spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom." And we all, with unveiled faces, contemplate God's glory. And as we do, we're transformed into the image and likeness of God. And now these three remain. This is really it. Faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. And so, as trite and cliche as it is to say, I hope that this week you find a way to love yourself, to accept your flaws as you see them, to accept grace as it comes to us in veiled form, to be reminded moment to moment that you're loved and that you're held, and that in deepest time and deepest truth, you're exactly where you're meant to be. I hope it's a beautiful week, and I hope everybody finds a plumpy cat to sit on their desk. Thanks for hanging with me. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being you. I love you guys. Peace.